Chapter 16 Pacing the Cage. June 30th, 1998. Skein River. Laura hoisted the paddle out of the water and placed it sideways along the canoe's narrow gunwales. She stretched, but kept a dreamy eye on the crystal drops that beaded on the varnished oak and splashed down to their source of origin. Everything returned to its roots. Just as the clouds above would condense into rain, which would fall and replenish the river that they rode upon, so would she die, be returned to the ground, and give new life to the soil in which she was interred. The canoe bobbed underneath her. Small waves slapped along the bow. Somewhere in the expanse of pine trees, a hawk screeched. The scene was a lullaby, the canoe a gentle mother, rocking her to sleep. The sun disappeared behind a transient rain cloud. Lights out. Bedtime. A sad smile. She would sleep soon enough. She shook the thought away and returned focus to the currents of pain that coursed through her body. She leaned back, arching her spine and feeling the successive click of her vertebrae. The ghosts of sutures choked hot filaments through her chest. "You okay there?" She took a breath of river musk and turned towards the boat's stern. Jer's face was a silhouette under the brim of his tilly hat. His glasses flashed like examination lights. "Yeah, just stretching." He straightened the boat with a series of awkward J-strokes. She was the better canoeist. It angered her that she no longer had the strength to sit at the stern. "You want to take a break?" Though her body yearned for nothing more, her will to continue held fast. The real world waited for her on those rocky banks, while on the gentle water, time seemed to flow backward. In the canoe, she was not Laura Houseman, 29-year-old architectural designer and skeletal wreck. Laura Houseman did not take a week's unpaid vacation to go camping with her husband. She would not shirk off her physiotherapy or counseling. Could Laura of the Skein River still be Laura Newton, girl of unspecified age, where careers and certification and chemotherapy were not things one fretted over? "No, I'm good." She plucked at the blisters below her fingers. "You sure?" A prickle of annoyance. "When aren't I sure about anything?" "Just asking." He paused. "You want some water?" "I have water." "A granola bar?" "No thanks." "A sandwich?" "Sure." She set her features to the look of impending damnation and hellfire. Before her anger bubbled to the surface, she noticed that the lower half of Jer's face was cracked into a mischievous grin. She dropped the scowl and returned his smile. "I'm a big girl. I feel okay." She shouldn't fault him. Any decent person would worry about her, and Jeremy Houseman was a very decent person. "Some Gatorade?" Irritating, but decent. She palmed a handful of water at him. He cursed and wiped at his glasses. "You're mean. I'm allowed to be mean." She spun, dipped the paddle back into the water, and steered the boat straight. Glancing up at the sun, she estimated that it was roughly 3 in the afternoon. She was loath to admit, even to herself, that she didn't have much stamina left. After supper, they would probably have to set up camp. The treatment board assured her that the fatigue and malaise were temporary side effects of the drugs and radiation. At what point did a symptom stop being temporary? Was it more than 16 months? She peered over the gunwale. A stranger's wavering face peered back. Who was this ossified wraith? Of eyeless visage and a frieze of dark hair. Laura Newton, girl of unspecified age, had a round face, large eyes, and poker-straight hair the color of shellacked maple. The woman in the water could not be her. It was impossible. She cast her eyes to the tree line, ignoring the water harpy. She was free from its grasp so long as she remained in the dry safety of the canoe. "So, you never finished your story," Jer said. "How did you hear about Victory Lake Campground?" She stopped paddling and leaned back, thankful for the respite. "You remember Kurt Weiser? The guy who cheated on you in college?" "Yeah. The bastard, what about him?" "He had family in Raccoon City. When we were dating, we were gonna canoe from Klein Falls to Victoria Lake and get his uncle to drive us back." A pause. Jer chuckled. "So you mean that our first vacation together is based on plans you made with another guy? I hope you're not pining for a lost love here." She could tell by his tone that he was not serious. She decided to play along. "Well, you know how I feel about tall blonde guys who love the outdoors." Another chuckle. "Yeah, you've been with enough of them." She gasped and spun in her seat, look of impending damnation and hellfire firmly affixed. The canoe listed sharply. Water slurped over the low gunwale. "That is not even close to funny." She jabbed an accusatory finger toward him. Jer attempted to laugh. He caught sight of her expression, and his nervous titter sputtered into nothingness. "In what universe does someone say that to their wife? For the record, Kurt Weiser is dead to me. I knew that it would take about 3 days to go down this river, and that there was a nice hotel in Latham we could stay in, although now I'm considering separate rooms." Jer, even after 5 years' marriage, he was capable of near autistic levels of thoughtlessness. He spent far too much time in front of a computer screen and not nearly enough interacting with other adults. "Come on, Figgy." His infuriating reconciliatory tone begged her to send a fresh salvo of barbed comments. "I was just teasing." "Idiot. Asshole." Another accusatory finger. "You have lost your speaking privileges." She turned her back to him and paddled with renewed vigor. 5 minutes of silence passed. A large fish broke the water in a silver half-moon. "Laura?" No response. "I'm sorry." A swarm of gnats haloed her. She swatted an idle hand at them. Hey, look at that." An old tactic. Clumsy efforts at diversion. She would not take the bait. The flies and mosquitoes held more interest. "Seriously, what is that?" The canoe canted as he shifted up onto his haunches. "Okay, fine." "What is what?" "That." He had one pipe-thin arm outstretched. She followed the line cast by his finger into the blanket of trees. An obsidian peak thrust out of the forest, the upper edges bordered in wrought iron lace. She shaded her eyes, could make out the rectangular jut of dormers, each with a single muntined window which glinted sightless in the sun. She steadied herself and stretched out for an improved view. The canoe lolled erratically. Slate roof, ashlar masonry, plantation-style design. Wait a minute, I know this place. She balled her hands into fists, another wonderful side effect of chemotherapy, memory loss. After what seemed like an hour's worth of dredging the murky depths that were her damaged memory banks, she attached a name to the approaching building. George Trevor. Her fingernails dug into chafed palms. She felt near tears. At one point in her life, she had known very well that George Trevor, architect and eccentric, had completed his final oeuvre somewhere in the Arklay forest. Her main lamentation in regards to the philandering Kurt Weiser had stemmed from the knowledge that she would not be traveling into the forest and chancing upon a piece of architectural history. She stood up in the canoe. Joe called out in alarm. Laura had known these things, and they had slipped into the vortex. How many other parcels of her life had Chemo Brain stolen from her? Laura! What? She didn't bother facing him. You're gonna tip us, sit down. She slid to her knees, hands on the gunwales. She kept her eyes on the nearing mansion, and gradually, anger gave way to childlike enthusiasm that she thought had been lost forever. Her lips twitched into a small smile. George Trevor's last commission, lost and forgotten, sat less than a mile from her. "What is it?" he asked. "It's the Spencer estate. One of my favorite architects designed it." "Really? It looks older than dirt." Joe was dead on with his assessment. The building was less than 50 years old, but it smacked of something out of the 16th century. It was a masterpiece, an astonishing display of Trevor's passion for Gothic design. "It was built in '68. No kidding." "Nope. It's newer than our house." George Trevor was really influenced by Gothic revival. He was huge in Europe, rebuilding cathedrals after the war, and he hated the modernist movement. He wrote a bunch of articles in Architecture Today calling Walter Gropius and the rest of the Bauhaus a bunch of visionless commies. "Commies?" Joe chuckled. "It was a big deal at the time. Anyway, a British lord hired him to design this mansion, his American home. He vanished a few months after it was finished." "Who? The Brit?" "No, Trevor, along with his family." "No way." He sounded genuinely interested. It was a rarity for a subject not about software design, video games, or college basketball. Laura craned her neck. A kaleidoscope of stained glass adorned a second-story wall. She grinned. The Spencer estate flew in the face of the functionalist aesthetic that was so cherished by the majority of post-war designers. It was a pity that the late Gothic revival had lost steam after Trevor's disappearance. The Spencer estate was doubtlessly his forgotten legacy. "The place looks creepy," Joe said. "It's abandoned." "Already?" "Yeah, that Lord Spencer. He lived in it for about 5 years and then moved back to England." "He didn't sell it?" She shook her head. "Nope, he just locked the doors and moved away." Man, what a waste. She could hear the tusk in his voice. If there was one thing Joe despised, it was the fickle expenditure of money. "Tell me about it." "It's beautiful." There was a sudden pronounced thrashing at the canoe's stern. The bow veered towards shore. She swiveled backward. Joe was paddling like a man possessed. "What are you doing?" She spun to the right and began a series of frantic draw strokes in an effort to straighten the boat. Joe laughed and doubled his efforts, easily overpowering her. "We're going ashore, Figgy." "What? Why?" She continued her struggle to steer the boat downriver. White foam churned alongside the bow deck. "We're going to check out the mansion." "Is he crazy?" "No, we can't." "Sure we can." "No, Joe." "Stop." The insane paddling slackened. She could hear Joe taking gallon breaths of air. "Why can't we?" A deep breath. "You said it's abandoned." She spun to face him. His tilly hat dangled on its drawstring. His chest rose and fell with every breath. "Figgy, why can't we?" The river tugged the canoe sideways, and the roof of Spencer's empty mansion crowned Joe's head. "Straighten us out," she said. Joe sighed, sticking in his paddle and ruddering the boat straight. "You didn't answer me. Why can't we check it out?" "Well, it would be trespassing, for one. Besides, it might have guards." "I'm not talking about busting down a door and stealing their VCR. I'm just saying that we should take a walk around." He was using his "you're such a widow dummy" voice. She contemplated sending a paddle full of water at him. "We just shouldn't. We're grown-ups, not teenagers on some... Come on, stop being such a wet blanket." Or maybe the paddle itself. "Joe, drop it, okay?" "No way." I saw how you looked at that place. You want to go over there. She sighed. Ever since she got sick, Joe had stumbled over himself to accommodate her every whim. She found it humiliating, debasing. He seemed to be of the mind that a double fudge ice cream sundae from across town would cure the malignancy that festered in her breasts and lymph nodes. Of course I do, but what's the worst that it'll do? Yell at us? Joe, answer me. No answer. Laura, life is too short. If your cancer has taught us anything, it should be that. Though it was a shock to hear him use the words Laura and cancer in the same sentence, something he avoided at all costs, it was the first bit that had her flummoxed. Life is short. He had no idea how right he was sometimes. Laura? She cast a sidelong glance at the mansion and chewed her bottom lip. Life is short. Okay, fine, but if we get arrested, I swear I'll kill you. Joe whooped and pointed the canoe toward a smooth patch of shoreline. His enthusiastic cheer spooked a large congregation of crows. They pitched into a screeching black swarm. Be quiet, you idiot. Joe laughed and nosed the canoe into the coarse gravel riverbank. Her head bobbed forward, and with sudden deceleration, the water in the bilge rolled up and soaked into her runners. She rose, unable to stifle the grin that formed. The Spencer estate waited to be investigated. Perhaps real life didn't wait on the banks. Laura of the Skene River was on dry land, and yet she was not Laura Houseman, 29-year-old architectural designer and skeletal wreck. She was Laura, historian, or possibly archaeologist, uncovering a forgotten chapter in 20th century architecture. Do you want your camera? He asked. She wouldn't need to take pictures, though Joe would be suspicious if she didn't snap a few. The last thing she wanted was any more concern. Sure. They clambered out of the canoe. Laura stretched her termite-ridden frame and massaged the hollow divot in her left armpit, watching as Joe lugged the boat further up the bank. She turned to the mansion, an indistinct grey smudge among the many hues of forest green. Somewhere far off, the Crow Convention continued their outraged chatter. Here you are. Joe passed her the camera and hiked at his cargo pants. Let's go exploring. Joe took the lead, breaking trail, swinging a chunk of deadfall like a machete. In his wide-brimmed hat, hiking boots, and khakis, he looked like a gangly kid playing Indiana Jones. All that was missing was the bullwhip. So, why did Lord What's-His-Face abandon this mansion so soon? He asked. No one knows. Their voices seemed to amplify among the trees. Weird. Yes, apparently he was. I wonder if it's haunted. No, it's too new to be haunted. They weaved their way through the underbrush and were nearing a comb of red-black bars stretching out around the estate. Joe stopped at the fence, wrought iron of Germano-Gothic design. 8 feet above them, triple-strung barbed wire hung slack between the fence posts. Laura ran one hand along the scabbed metal. It's not even cast steel. This is the real stuff. It must have cost a fortune. Looks like we've hit a roadblock, Figgy. She stretched her view along the length of fencing. Just as it faded into the jumble of green, it arched up several feet. There's a gate up there. She was already headed for it. They traced their way along the fence. The barbed wire clicked against the posts, and Laura was reminded of the pictures taken of concentration camp inmates pacing the confines of their prison. Her impression was reinforced as they neared the open cavity of the double gates. The rusted steel, the filaments of loose barbed wire, it looked like the photos of the Auschwitz gates Rabbi Barsky brought back from his European tour. Only instead of Arbeit macht frei written in Straperon lettering above the gates, a painted sign hung to the right, much newer than the rail it was wired to. Private property, Keep out. Guard dogs on duty. On one side of the warning, Umbrella's red and white pinwheel logo. On the other, a savage-looking dog's head, muzzle open to reveal a jagged snarl of vicious teeth. Jer turned his back to the sign. "Well, have you seen enough?" he asked. Laura squinted through the arched entrance. She could make out some sort of courtyard, limestone retaining walls, spilling their overgrown foliage onto slick cobblestone, a bronze statue, the features fuzzy with cheese-mold verdigris. "Let's go in," she said. "What? Can't you read? They've got guard dogs." Typical Jer, all macho and no action. "The gate's wide open." She swept one arm through the entrance to demonstrate. "And it's not like we were all too quiet coming here. Do you hear any dogs?" He cast his head around, scratching the rat's whiskers at the corners of his mouth. The wind whistled and the crows squawked. There was nary a bark nor growl. "No." "Do you hear anything at all?" "No." "See? We're fine. Besides, whose idea was this anyway?" "Mine." "That's right, come on." She brushed past him and headed for the courtyard. Jer cursed under his breath and tailed along. "I saw the umbrella logo on that sign." His voice was a near whisper, and he walked with the careful tiptoes of a cartoon burglar. "I thought that Lord What's-His-Face owned it." Spencer was part owner of Umbrella. Maybe he handed the title over to the business. What would a drug company want with this place? She shrugged. Who knows? The crows settled and leaded silence fell upon them. She could hear every footfall, the anemic squeak of rusty metal. The wind gusted and spun up a whirlwind of leaves. "This place is spooky." Joe kicked at the decapitated head of a concrete cherub. "It's gothic. It's supposed to be a bit spooky." They were on a dedicated path now, circular stone slabs set into mossy pea gravel. The wind tugged at her, and she shivered. Even a faint breeze riled her goosebumps. Metal squeaked. Joe's feet scrunched along. The wind seemed to groan through the maze of ivy-marbled limestone walls. "Let's turn around," he said. She wasn't leaving yet. Trevor had shipped Italian marble columns to line the main entrance's portico. She owed it to herself, as well as the forgotten Trevor, to run her hands along their glassy surface. Maybe she would knock on the main doors, or peek through a few windows. Life is short. "Just give me a minute." She remembered the camera, a fitting excuse. "I want one good picture to show Gloria." She brushed a hand along an overturned granite planter. The backside of the mansion reared up to the sky 100 yards ahead, its windows hollow like a skull's eye holes. They skulked like grave robbers through the courtyard. Joe was right about one thing. The Spencer estate was definitely a bit creepy in its current state of neglect. The mansion's masonry, shipped by rail from Indiana after Trevor declared the local limestone substandard, was greasy and inked over with mildew. The friable edge bricks were eroded to quarter rounds. Moss bearded the eaves and soffits. What a waste. Something flapped against her bare shin. She bent and stared, curious at the sheet of waterlogged 8x11 paper. "It's like the combination of every haunted house I've ever seen." She ignored Jer and scooped up the paper, frowning. The page was margin to margin gibberish, an alphabet soup of numbers, letters, and characters, interspersed with an occasional line of vaguely scientific jargon. T expeditor elongates both strands to complete synthesis of a double-stranded proviral DNA with the structure. Huh? Jer asked, turning around. Do you have any idea what this stuff means? She handed him the sheet. Jer adjusted his glasses. His lips moved as he scanned the dot matrix hieroglyphs. No clue. It's not computer code. He flipped the page. It's something about genetics, I think. There's paper everywhere. Laura wandered past a waist-high retaining wall. Along the cobblestones, a redwood's worth of printer paper tumbled like oversized confetti. On the opposite side of the courtyard, a squad of crows huddled together atop a garden shed roof, eyeing them with a mugger's interest. Let's get out of here. Jer had that plaintive tone in his voice. So much about him irritated her. Laura, this place is obviously not abandoned. She dropped her hands to her sides and turned to him with an exasperated sigh. Do you think this place would be such a mess if people were here? Well, Umbrella probably uses the mansion for storage or something. This stuff could have blown out of a broken window. Now come on. She altered the tone of her voice to emulate his own. Quit being such a wet blanket. Jer grunted and shook his head, a look of abject frustration on his narrow face. A moment later, he sulked off toward a concrete gazebo that looked like an OSHA nightmare. She returned her attention to the scientific ticker tape parade. A few windswept pages of watermarked printer paper collected between her feet. She snatched them up and eyed them like a blueprinter. The pages were crumpled and torn in places, covered in the same nonsensical language. The one did have a title of sorts, written in blue ballpoint in the upper margin. Amplification of T-strain T1B3A in Hedera helix genus over multiple generations. H. Sarton. 2/1898. She turned the page over. The other papers slipped from her hand and glided away, bent in half circles by the wind. 2 words were scrawled diagonally across the page in lipstick red Sharpie. She squinted and held the page closer, as if observing the message from a tighter vantage would provide insight into its meaning. Feed fishies? She chewed her bottom lip. In the distance, metal squeaked. A tree branch cracked. Feed fishies, I think he meant. It looks like it was written by a kindergartner. The wind groaned. Her sweatshirt flapped around her. She shivered and hustled over to where Jer was standing. H. Sarton's memo slipped from her fingers and was carried off. As she neared, Jer bent and disappeared behind a retaining wall. A moment later, he re-emerged with a small rectangular box in his hands. What is this thing? She tugged at his shirt. He acknowledged her silently and returned to his discovery. The box seemed to be a remote control of some sort. The antenna was bent askew, and the battery dangled by its cord like a robotic viscera. She forgot her unease and smiled to herself. Jer, the technological bloodhound, makes another stunning discovery. It's like a souped-up garage door opener. He flipped at a switch labeled BOW-ENC4. A red indicator light above the switch blinked a response. Where did you find it? Right here. He pointed to the ball and flipped the BOW-ENC5 switch. I should probably leave it alone, though. Good idea. You don't... The words died in her throat. For a moment, she could have sworn that a pale face was leering down at them from behind a second-story window. She took a hasty step toward her husband. What's wrong? Somewhere far off came the sound of steel barrels being knocked over. They both craned their necks. She tugged at his shirt sleeve. I think I've seen enough. Yeah, me too. He was already a few steps ahead of her. They turned on their heels and began making their way back to the Auschwitz gate. The wind picked up, buffeting them with dead leaves and pages of errant science speak. Somewhere above them came the unmistakable hollow thud of a palm smacking against glass. Jer reached a hand back and grabbed her wrist. Let's hurry. Another fleshy smack against glass, a drawn-out screech of tired hinges. Yeah, let's go. She forced her new post legs into a stiff run. They passed a rush-streaked metal sign with arrows bent in various directions. Guardhouse, BOW enclosure, laboratory. Her heartbeat accelerated. A terracotta handprint smudged out most of the word laboratory. Behind them, at the garden shed, their avian audience tore off in a screeching scattershot of black feathers. Laura spun. She felt her frame quaking under her oversized sweater. The garden shed's metal door shuddered against its wooden frame. Above the door, steel letters were bolted to the siding, letters similar to those at the Auschwitz. Only the message was far more menacing than the deceptively optimistic Arbeit macht frei. The message was simple. In fact, it was only one word. Kennels. Guard dogs on duty. The door dished outward. She could hear the tinder crack of spitting wood, a muffled bark. Oh, no! They were running now. The squadron of crows circled overhead. Jer hooked his arm around her waist. Over the wind, the crows, and the hammering at the garden door came the icy tinkle of shattering plate glass. From a window above their heads, a muslin white arm groped from the dark void of the mansion. Come on, hurry, hurry, hurry! I am hurrying, her legs taking 2 paces for every one of his. The scar tissue across her chest banded her burning lungs. A pronounced smack of metal against brick ran through the clamor. Laura glanced over her shoulder and managed to outscream everything else. Behind them, the guard dogs on duty were loose, long, dark, snarling shapes, squat torpedoes with flashing teeth honing in on them. Joe must have known what was coming. He ramped up his pace, his feet kicked up scraps of moss. He was half carrying, half pushing her. His eyes were fear-crazed behind crooked glasses, his hat parachuted behind him on its drawstring. She could hear at least 4 distinctive barks, the scrunching of padded feet behind them. She no longer had enough breath to scream. A rough shove launched her forward. Go! Jer hollered. She sprinted ahead, her chest full of molten steel. She was half blind from lack of oxygen, the surroundings a various blur of greens and browns. Spring-loaded branches raised welts against her bare skin. The dogs gained ground. The crows screeched, and the wind howled. Gonna die. Oh God, not like this. Jer's arm wrapped around her. She was momentarily lifted off the ground as he carried her like an ungainly squirming sack of cement. Her toes dragged channels through the dirt. She reclaimed her footing and sprung ahead. How far was the canoe? They would never get it launched. They were going to be torn apart. Over her own gasps for breath, she could hear the click of powerful jaws. Oh God! Jer was at her side, stooped and screaming the same words over and over again. The trees! Climb the trees!